I don't want any Google Analytics. What will basically happen is the project will be created. Let's look at creating a Firestore project. So we can go to the Firebase console, add a project, and you just put in the name you want to use. So say foobar. There won't be any collections because you create your collections on the fly. As you use them, they get created. So here's our foobar, and then we want to go ahead and add, let's say, an app. And the important thing that we get from here is some configuration. This configuration provides an app ID, some other sorts of things that are needed for this particular config. And then once we have the configuration, we'll go ahead and initialize the application. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. What I'm going to do to begin with is let's, just look at using JavaScript. Well, what you need is to install Firebase, right? So you can do that either from the command line with npm install Firebase, or you can do that if you're using WebStorm. You can go ahead and create a script that will do that for you in your project. But you'd need to run that once. And then once you've done that, you can use Firebase. My recommendation is going to be to use the version 8 API, which is not the newest API. So you can go ahead and use the version 8 API from the new SDK as long as you import from Firebase /compat for compatible. And then once you've done that, what you'll do is go ahead and take your Firebase config with all of your fields in it. And so this, of course, is one time. And once you have that, then you initialize your application. Okay, so that's just a one-time thing you need to do. And you initialize it with your config. And at that point, what you can do now is get the Firestore database. What are the sorts of things that you can do? Of course, you can add items. So for example, if you want to add to a root level collection, you would just say db.collection. And then you specify the collection's name. So let's say it is restaurants. And so that now is a reference to the restaurants collection. And then you can go ahead and add to that. So there's a couple of things you can do. There is a specific add, right, which you can use. And then you'll just pass in a object with your fields in it. This might be name, hobos, and the cuisine, which is brunch, and whatever else you want. Now, as far as an ID, you can go ahead and just let it generate an ID, or you can put in an ID explicitly if you want. It's usually probably easier to just go ahead and put it an ID. So maybe what we'll do is we'll generate a unique ID, and I'll generate probabilistically unique ID. Once you have a document, you can change quite easily. Let's say you want to modify a particular field in the document, then you can use the update method. So you can do the same thing of getting the collection. And from the collection, you can get the document. And this would be whatever the ID was. So whatever the stored ID, since we generated it before, we know what it is. And from here, then we can go ahead and update. And so when we update, we can then go ahead and provide just the fields that we want to update. And it'll leave the other fields alone. So you can use add to add a new one. You can use updates to modify the fields of an existing one. And this can be, of course, one or more fields. And then you can also use .set to just completely change the values. That's really all there is to adding. Now let's look at subcollections. So subcollections are really fairly straightforward. So basically, any record, you can always do a dot collection. So basically, if we said rec equals db dot collection of restaurants, just imagine we spell that right, doc, and then we have here a restaurant ID. We can always then, from that, do a rec.collection. Let's say reviews. And from that, we can get a doc if we have a particular review ID. So we can always alternate basically collection, doc, collection, doc. And at any point in time, we can stop and we'll have either a collection or a document. And then once we have the document reference, we can go ahead and update it. Now, if we want to get data, there are two different possibilities. We can either get the data just one time, or we can get the data and then listen for any updates. So if we just do a get, so let's say we, for instance, at this point, did a rec.get. I'll just ignore that right there. So the record is this one restaurant. Then that is going to return us the document itself. This is an asynchronous call, however. So let's learn just a little bit about JavaScript asynchronous calls. So what happens is we can actually say, let's say rec.get, and after the get succeeds, which is asynchronous, then we want to do something else. So then we provide a function that will get called with the actual document. So we're going to write an arrow function that takes the document and then can go ahead and write to the log the name of the restaurant. So that it'd be doc.data.name. Doc.data.cuisine or so on. As well as getting a particular document, you can also get multiple documents by doing a query. So we can go ahead and take a collection. So here we're getting a single doc by ID. Here we're going to get multiple documents from a collection. So we go ahead and then we do a query. And so a query can do something, can have where clauses. So where, for instance, let's say cuisine, and then is equal, and let's say it's brunch. So this is a query that we can make. We can go ahead and for our query, we do a get. And then what happens is, again, we have a callback routine that's passed and we get a query snapshot passed into that routine. And what a query snapshot you can do is basically iterate over a query snapshot. So we could do, for instance, a for each on that. And the iteration gives us documents. So now we've got another routine that will, let's say here, log to the console. And for the document, we can do document.data. So that will go ahead and retrieve a query snapshot. Now we could go ahead and retrieve all of the documents in a particular collection, by just getting rid of the where clause. So we could say db.collection of restaurant.get, and then we would be called back with the then part once the documents in the collection have been received. We can provide multiple where clauses, but that's of course going to require a compound query. And then we also have an option of sorting. In the sorting case, you would do ordering. So basically, if you want to do sorting, you would do some sort of a collection. It's top level DB collection, .restaurants. We can put in any number of where clauses, and then we can, at the end, add in an order by. We pass in the field name, like for instance, let's say it's average rating. And by default, it's ascending. If we want descending, and we put in the string DSC. So then we can do, of course, a .get to actually get the documents that match the query. You can also add in a .limit. So basically, we can take an existing query, and we can always add in a .limit number, let.limit 5. This is a minimal query, right? This query will get all of the documents in the restaurant. We can reduce which documents are returned by adding in where clauses. And then we can also change the ordering with an order by. And finally, we can go ahead and do limit. That would be a full-fledged query. Collection dot where clauses, where the wheres can be equal, but they can also be relational, like greater than or equal, or less than or equal, or less than or not equal, and so on. We have 0 or more of those. Of course, if we have more than one, we're going to need a compound index. And then we can end with an order by, and then we can do a limit. And then finally, we go ahead and do a go. Now, one of the really nice things that Firestore has is the ability to have real-time updates. So the way that's done is you create a listener, and this listener, you can listen to either a document or listen to an entire set of documents in a collection. So basically, when you have a query, you can listen for the documents in that query. And then your callback is going to be called when there are changes to those. So the difference is we have a query. We can do query.get, or we could do document.get. And these both do a line fetch of the data. If we do a query.onSnapshot, we can pass in a function that's going to get called whenever any items in that query change. Or similarly, we can do a doc.onSnapshot. So if we do a doc.onSnapshot, we are going to pass in a function that gets called every time the document changes. And similarly, on the onSnapshot, we're going to get called back with a query snapshot function every time the query snapshot changes. By default, we can just go through and be told the new state of things is what will happen. So when we call doc.onSnapshot, the first time this callback function is called with the current state of the document. If the document ever changes, then that callback is going to get called with whatever the new value of the document is. Let's say we have our web app deployed and 2 people are editing the same document. If one of them changes the name and the other has registered a snapshot listener, then so we have here, we've got here user 1 and user 2 has done a doc.onSnapshot. And our data in this document is, let's say, just a single piece of data, which is a name. And the name is ABC. Okay. So user two's listener is going to get called with this particular document that has the name ABC. Now, if user one does a dot update on that document and changes the name to XYZ, then user two's listener is going to get called again. So basically what happens is the listener gets called the first time with name ABC. And then second time, it's going to get called after it was changed on another machine with name XYZ. So first with ABC, second time with XYZ. Okay, so that's great. So if it's changed on another machine, it'll update. What that says for us is we just really need to register a snapshot handler for the things we're interested in, and then we'll get called as any changes are made. And by default, we'll just get called with all the new data. It's possible to obtain what the changes were. So if something was added, if we're looking at a collection, for instance, if a document was added or deleted or changed, and if so, what the changes were. But the simpler way is just to treat the snapshot as, here's your total new data, or as your document, here's your replacement document, and not care about the individual changes. That, in fact, fits very well with React, for example, where we're just re-rendering from the current state of things. And so these listeners tell you what the new state of things is. There's something really clever about the design of this. So if we are on, this is user two and user one. So we have user one and we have user two. And what we've said is that if user one changes the name, that's going to cause indirectly the listener to be called. Right? The listener that's listening for that document or listening for that document among others from a collections query. So the listener gets called and we find the name to change. But the tricky thing as well is, let's say user two updates of that record. Firestore is going to do a local call to the listener. That is, it's going to report back to the cloud. So basically what happens is when user one changes the name, that goes to the cloud, then pushes a notification saying the listener called. Okay. If user two updates the name, that's going to also send a message to the cloud. But it's not going to bother sending information back down to user two. So what's going to happen instead is the updating the name causes a local call to the listener. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. So one, Firestore knows if you're changing it locally and you have a listener, why wait for it to go back up to the cloud and then have information come back down from the cloud that says, hey, you just changed this, just one little bit, because you already know you changed it. You being the local Firestore API, right? The SDK there. So instead, the way that Firestore works is if you make a local change, it will report it back up to the cloud, but it will also then figure out what listener or listeners to call locally. And that's also good for speed. So one is we remove unnecessary communication, which is basically the listener call back. And the second thing is we get speed. And we actually get a third nice thing too, which is if you're offline, it can just buffer or cache that information. So it'll buffer that information until you come back online. And what this allows then is for your application to just be listener driven if it wants. So the way you get notified of any changes to any documents is by using a listener. And so your program can operate by, when the user has done something that requires data to change, don't change the data directly. Instead, call Firestore to change. And Firestore is then going to call your listener, and your listener is going to re-render with that new data. So that fits in perfectly with how React works. That's really what you need to know for using Firestore for the raw API. Let's look at actually some hooks that have been created for using with React. So for using React with Firestore, there is a package which is called React Firebase hooks. Okay, so this is a hook, just like useState is a hook, just like useEffect is a hook. And so the idea is you can create a query or create a document reference, right? You can document reference, as you say, database.collection or whatever your collection is, doc. Doc ref will often look something like db.collection of lists, let's say restaurants dot doc of whatever your restaurant ID is. Or we can also have a query, which looks like over some collection. Let's just say we throw in a where clause. Again, this is a valid query all by itself, but we can throw in where clauses, we can throw in an order by, we can throw it a limit. Let's in fact just leave it like this. What we can do then is in a component, we can call use document or use collection. So use document and pass in a document reference, or use collection and pass in a query. When we do that, we get back a triplet. So this is for either use collection or use document. We get the triplet, which consists of value, loading, and error. So the idea is when this hook first runs, you're going to get back loading is true. So first time, loading is true. And value is going to be null and error is going to be null. So you don't really have your data yet. But what you do have is the information that you're loading. So you could go ahead and put up something on the screen that says you're loaded, right? So you're in your component, you just look at loading and decide to put up some string that says loading. And don't try and actually use your data. Use your restaurants, for example. So this is asynchronous. So the first time you call it, it's going to immediately return loading is true. And then it's going to wait for actually the loading to finish. So it's going to wait for the network communication to work and come out back with either the document or the snapshot for the collection. And at that point, then it re-renders, your component gets called again. And this time, second time, loading is false and value contains either your document, if we did use document. So value is either a document or a snapshot. If it's a document, use document.data function. If it's a snapshot, you're going to iterate. And for each of these, you're going to have a document, and you can use document.data for each of those. The key thing is this re-rendering is going to happen automatically. So basically what's happened is use document and use collection both register a listener. Whenever the listener is called, that's going to cause the component that has the hook in it to re-render. And you're going to get a new value. And if there's some sort of an error, like for instance, you're missing an index or that might be one example, then you're going to actually get an error in the error return from the hook. But all you do at this point is you install the hook. Let's say you're looking at a document, you call use document, and then your component is going to re-render every time any field in the document changes, and you're getting basically a new value for value. And so when you call .data on it, then you're going to get the fields of that document. Similarly, if you make a query and call use collection on the query, then if there's anything that would change the results of the query, so either there's a new document that would be returned by the query, or there's a document that's been deleted that belongs to the query, or if any of the documents in the query have changed, you're going to re-render and you're getting a new value for value. And when you iterate over that and then get the data, something about it's going to be different. Key thing about this is if you've got a query that's, let's say, limited to the city as Austin, if new documents are added to your collection in other cities, that's not going to affect your listener. And that's not going to cause you to re-render. Only if new documents are added to Austin, or documents are removed for Austin, or any Austin documents have any fields in them changed. And in that case, you will re-render. And when you re-render, you're going to get a new value. And when you iterate over that value, you're going to get new documents and you're going to re-render them and all's good. So this is all that's really involved with using React, is these two fairly simple hooks. Now, there are some other hooks involved with here. So use document, use collection, both do install a listener. If you want to just get a document one time or a collection one time, you can do that. In that case, you're just getting you're getting a current snapshot of it, and you're not going to be notified of any changes. But we still use the value loading error mechanism, because when you call it, even if you want a single value and have no listener, it's still going to be loading the first time probably, because it has to go out to the network because of this asynchronicity. And so the first time loading will be true, and then the second time loading will be false, and value will have the value that you need.